The moment the collapse began, it did not arrive with warning signs or gentle signals. It came suddenly, violently, and all at once, as if an invisible hand had reached into every stable corner of their life and pulled the foundations apart in a single night. The plans they spent years building started failing without explanation. Phone calls stopped coming. Opportunities disappeared. Relationships that once felt permanent became cold and distant. Even the places that once gave comfort suddenly felt unfamiliar, heavy, and empty. At first, they believed it was simply bad luck, a temporary season of stress. But deep inside, there was a growing feeling that something far greater was happening beneath the surface of reality. Every attempt to repair the damage only seemed to make things worse. The harder they fought to regain control, the more life slipped through their fingers like sand. Sleep became difficult because the mind refused to rest. Questions echoed endlessly through the night. Why is this happening? Why now? Why does everything I trusted suddenly feel unstable? Fear slowly turned into exhaustion, and exhaustion turned into silence. Yet in that silence, something strange began to emerge. Beneath the chaos was a hidden pattern. The destruction did not feel random anymore. It felt targeted, precise, intelligent. Almost as if an unseen architect had examined every weak structure in their life and decided it could no longer remain standing. The career they once worshipped had become an identity prison. The relationships they begged to keep alive were secretly draining their spirit. The routines they depended on were numbing their purpose. What looked like loss was actually exposure. The collapse was revealing what had always been fragile, but human nature resists demolition. They kept trying to save things that heaven had already marked for removal. They revisited old conversations, hoping to revive dead connections. They chased doors that had already closed in the spiritual realm. They tried to rebuild broken foundations while ignoring the growing feeling in their soul that they were never meant to return to the old version of their life again. Then came the night when everything finally broke completely. Alone in the darkness, surrounded by uncertainty, they reached the end of their own strength. No more strategies, no more pretending to understand, no more confidence in human control. And, in that painful moment of surrender, they sensed something terrifying yet strangely holy. The collapse was not punishment. It was reconstruction. The divine architect had begun dismantling the old blueprint of their existence, because the future waiting ahead could not be built on damaged foundations. Every disappointment had a purpose. Every closed door carried intention. Every painful separation was clearing space for something their current life could not yet contain. The fear they felt was not the fear of destruction. It was the fear of transformation, because transformation always feels like death before it feels like rebirth. The old identity was crumbling, and the soul could sense it. That is why nothing familiar felt comfortable anymore. That is why old habits suddenly felt empty. That is why certain people vanished without explanation. The unseen reconstruction had already begun. While they mourned what was leaving, heaven was preparing what was coming. But the process required something difficult. Silence, not panic, not interference. Silence. The architect could not build while they constantly tried to resurrect the ruins. So little by little, life forced them into stillness. The noise faded. The distractions disappeared. The endless striving finally exhausted itself, and within that emptiness came the first realization that changed everything. Maybe the collapse was not happening to destroy them. Maybe it was happening to save them. Because sometimes the greatest act of divine mercy is not giving someone more comfort, more success, or more answers. Sometimes mercy arrives as demolition. Sometimes heaven removes what human hands would never willingly release. And although they could not yet see the full blueprint, deep within their spirit they began to understand that this night marked the beginning of a complete redesign of their future. The old life was ending, not because they were abandoned, but because they were being prepared for something greater than their current mind could imagine. After the collapse came the silence, and somehow the silence was even more terrifying than the destruction itself. At least during the chaos, there had been movement, distractions, problems to solve, people to call, and temporary illusions of control. But now, there was only stillness. The prayers that once brought comfort suddenly felt like they were disappearing into an empty sky. Nights became unbearably long because every thought echoed louder in the quiet. They begged heaven for signs, answers, direction, anything at all, but nothing seemed to come back. No miracle. No immediate breakthrough. No dramatic voice from above explaining why their life had been dismantled so completely. And slowly, a dangerous thought began creeping into their mind. Maybe they had been abandoned. Maybe the silence meant heaven had turned away from them. The human heart fears silence because silence forces confrontation with what noise once concealed. Without distractions, they could finally hear their own doubts, insecurities, and hidden fears speaking clearly for the first time. Every unanswered prayer felt personal. Every delayed breakthrough felt intentional. They watched other people move forward, while their own life seemed frozen in place, trapped inside an invisible waiting room where time itself felt heavy. Days blurred together, motivation disappeared. Even familiar routines became exhausting because deep inside they no longer recognized the person they used to be. Something fundamental had shifted during the collapse, and now the silence was completing what the destruction had started. But what they could not yet understand was that silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes, silence is the sound of invisible work taking place beyond human understanding. A building under reconstruction often looks abandoned before it becomes beautiful again. The divine architect had not disappeared. The architect was working beneath the surface where human eyes could not yet see. Every unanswered prayer was not rejection, but redirection. Heaven remained quiet because the old version of their life was still being removed layer by layer. There were attachments that still needed to break, fears that still needed exposure, identities that still needed to die. And if heaven had spoken too early, they would have tried to escape the process before the transformation was complete. So the silence continued. Yet within that silence, strange things started happening inside them. The desperation that once controlled their decisions slowly began fading. The constant need for validation weakened. The obsession with pleasing everyone around them started collapsing under the weight of exhaustion. For the first time in years, they were being forced to sit alone with themselves, without the masks, without the performance, without the noise that once distracted them from deeper truths. And it was painful. Painful, because they were finally seeing how much of their old life had been built on fear instead of purpose, how many choices had been made to avoid loneliness instead of fulfill destiny, how many relationships survived only because they were terrified of change. The silence became a mirror, revealing truths they had spent years avoiding. There were moments they wanted to run back to the old life simply because uncertainty felt unbearable. Even broken familiarity can feel safer than unknown transformation. But every attempt to return only created more emptiness. Old conversations felt hollow. Old environments felt spiritually dead. It was as if their soul itself refused to fit inside the old blueprint anymore. The reconstruction had progressed too far. Then, one night, in the middle of another sleepless battle with fear and confusion, a realization entered their spirit quietly but powerfully. Maybe heaven was silent because heaven was listening. Maybe the pause was not punishment but preparation. Architects do not explain every detail to the building while reconstruction is happening. They simply continue the work until the structure can hold the future it was designed for. And suddenly the silence no longer felt empty. It felt sacred. Terrifying, yes, but sacred, because beneath the stillness, something unseen was moving into place. The collapse had removed the visible foundations, but now heaven was rebuilding the invisible ones. Patience, discernment, emotional endurance, spiritual maturity, trust without proof. These things could not be formed in comfort or noise. They could only be formed in silence. The person who entered this season was not the same person who would leave it. That old identity had already begun dissolving the moment the demolition started. And although they still could not fully understand where the path was leading, one truth became impossible to ignore. The silence from heaven was not evidence of abandonment. It was evidence that the divine architect was still working, carefully and intentionally, in realms beyond human sight. At first, they believed the suffering was meaningless. Every betrayal felt personal, every delay felt cruel, and every closed door seemed like proof that life itself had turned against them. But as the silence stretched longer and the dust from the collapse slowly settled, something began changing deep within their awareness. Patterns started appearing where chaos once existed. Moments they once labeled as random pain suddenly seemed connected by an invisible design. It was subtle in the beginning, almost impossible to explain logically. A relationship that ended painfully had actually prevented a far greater destruction later. A missed opportunity that once felt devastating quietly redirected them away from an environment that would have drained their spirit completely. Even the people who abandoned them during their lowest moments unknowingly revealed truths that comfort had hidden for years. Slowly, painfully, they began realizing that nothing had collapsed without reason. There was a blueprint beneath the destruction all along. The divine architect had not been reacting emotionally or carelessly dismantling parts of their life out of punishment. Every removal had purpose. Every delay carried precision. Every season of confusion was strategically guiding them toward a future they could not yet fully comprehend. This realization frightened them because it meant the process was far bigger than human understanding. The suffering was not random chaos. It was intelligent reconstruction. And if the reconstruction was intentional, then perhaps even the darkest nights had meaning they could not yet see. The mind struggled to accept this because human nature wants immediate explanations. People want to know why the pain is happening while it is happening. They want heaven to provide full instructions before trust is required. But the hidden blueprint did not operate according to human comfort. It revealed itself only one piece at a time, enough to continue moving forward but never enough to regain total control. That uncertainty became part of the transformation itself. For years they had depended on certainty, routines, predictable outcomes, and carefully built plans to feel safe. But now the divine architect was teaching them to walk without seeing the entire staircase ahead, and every step demanded deeper surrender. Some nights they still questioned everything. Fear would return suddenly, whispering that maybe they were only imagining purpose inside the pain, because accepting randomness felt unbearable. But then another strange confirmation would appear at exactly the right moment. A conversation, a memory, a door opening unexpectedly after months of silence, a deep inner knowing impossible to explain logically. It felt as though invisible threads were slowly weaving together behind the seams, forming a picture only heaven could fully see. The blueprint remained hidden, but evidence of its existence became impossible to ignore. They began noticing how the old version of themselves would never have survived the future they were being prepared for. The old self was too dependent on approval, too afraid of loneliness, too attached to temporary comfort. That version of them would have destroyed the very blessings they once prayed for because their inner foundation was still unstable. So the architect first had to rebuild the person before revealing the destiny. This truth changed everything. Suddenly, the waiting no longer felt empty. The delays no longer felt pointless. Even the painful isolation gained meaning because isolation had stripped away distractions that once kept them spiritually asleep. The hidden blueprint was not merely about changing external circumstances. It was about transforming identity itself. Heaven was not just creating a new future. Heaven was creating a new person capable of carrying that future without collapsing under its weight. There were moments they mourned the life they lost, but deep inside they could also sense something sacred emerging beneath the grief. A stronger spirit, sharper discernment, greater emotional endurance, a strange peace that no longer depended on visible security. The reconstruction was working. Slowly, invisibly, relentlessly, the divine architect was replacing fear with wisdom and weakness with depth. And perhaps the most shocking realization of all was this: many of the things they once begged heaven to preserve had actually been obstacles standing in the way of their true path. The blueprint required space that their old life could never provide. That is why certain relationships had to end. That is why familiar environments suddenly became unbearable. That is why old dreams lost their emotional hold. The hidden blueprint demanded complete transformation, not small adjustments. It demanded the death of the false self so the authentic self could finally emerge. And although they still could not fully see where the road would end, they no longer viewed the collapse as evidence of destruction. Now they saw it as evidence of design. The divine architect had always known what the future required, long before the suffering began. Every painful moment had been measured carefully against a greater purpose. Nothing was wasted, nothing was accidental. Even the silence had meaning, especially the silence, because hidden beneath every unanswered question was a blueprint so vast, so precise, and so divinely orchestrated that human understanding alone could never fully contain it. The removals did not happen all at once. They came slowly, almost quietly, like invisible hands separating them from everything that no longer aligned with their future. At first, they fought against it desperately. They tried to hold on to relationships that had already emotionally disconnected. They kept revisiting conversations, hoping to revive old versions of people who were never meant to continue the journey with them. But the harder they clung to what was leaving, the heavier their spirit became. There was a painful truth unfolding beneath the surface. Not everyone connected to their past was designed for their future. Some people had only existed for a temporary season, yet they mistook temporary comfort for permanent destiny. The divine architect knew this long before the collapse began. That is why certain friendships suddenly became distant without explanation. That is why environments that once felt familiar now drained their energy the moment they entered them. Even old dreams started losing their emotional power, as if heaven itself was disconnecting their heart from attachments that could no longer survive the reconstruction. At first, they interpreted these removals as rejection. Human beings naturally fear loss because loss feels like failure. But over time, they began recognizing something deeper. Every removal was protection disguised as pain. Some people were blocking their growth without realizing it. Some environments kept them spiritually asleep. Some ambitions were rooted in ego rather than purpose. The removal phase was not about punishment. It was about clearing space. A new structure could not rise while the ruins of the old one still occupied the ground. And although loneliness became intense during this season, there was also freedom hidden inside it. The noise of false connections faded. The pressure to perform disappeared. For the first time in years, they were being separated from external validation, so they could finally hear the quieter voice within themselves. It was uncomfortable, terrifying even, but necessary, because destiny often requires isolation before elevation. The divine architect was teaching them that growth sometimes begins with subtraction, not addition. And the more they surrendered to the removals instead of resisting them, the more peace slowly replaced panic. They no longer chased every closed door. They no longer begged temporary people to stay permanently. Deep inside, they began understanding that heaven removes what human fear refuses to release. The process hurt because attachments were breaking, but those broken attachments were creating room for a future far greater than the past they were mourning. Then came the season where nothing made sense anymore. The old life was gone, but the new life had not yet appeared. They existed between two worlds, disconnected from the past, yet unable to clearly see the future. This became the most dangerous stage of the reconstruction, because uncertainty can break the human spirit faster than pain itself. During the collapse, at least there had been movement. During the removal phase, there had been visible changes. But now there was only waiting, endless, heavy waiting. Every day felt suspended in uncertainty. They woke up carrying questions nobody around them could answer. Why was heaven delaying everything? Why did every attempt to move forward feel blocked? Why did they feel so emotionally lost even after surrendering? The confusion slowly became exhausting because humans naturally crave clarity. They wanted signs, timelines, guarantees. Instead, they received silence mixed with fragments of intuition that only deepened the mystery. Some nights they almost convinced themselves to abandon the process entirely. Returning to old habits suddenly felt tempting because at least the old life was familiar. Even pain can become addictive when uncertainty feels unbearable. But every attempt to force clarity only produced more frustration. The divine architect was intentionally preventing them from rebuilding their old identity again. That identity had depended on control, prediction, and external security. The reconstruction required something deeper, trust without visible evidence. So the confusion continued. Yet beneath the uncertainty, invisible transformation was accelerating. Their emotional dependence on certainty slowly weakened. Their obsession with controlling outcomes began collapsing. For the first time in their life, they were learning how to survive without knowing every answer. And strangely, hidden beneath the fear, there was also freedom. Because once they stopped demanding complete understanding, they started noticing small moments of peace appearing in unexpected places. A quiet sunrise, a sudden feeling of calm during prayer, a strange certainty that despite appearances, they were still being guided. The confusion had not disappeared, but now it no longer controlled them completely. They began understanding that not every season is meant to be understood while living through it. Some seasons only reveal their purpose in hindsight. The divine architect was not asking them to understand the entire blueprint, only to continue walking even when visibility was low. And although the darkness still felt heavy, somewhere deep inside they sensed a truth too powerful to ignore. Confusion was not evidence they were lost. It was evidence they were no longer living according to the old map. One night, during the deepest part of the uncertainty, the warning arrived. It did not come through thunder or dramatic visions. It came quietly, almost like a thought whispered directly into their spirit. Do not interrupt the process. The words carried unusual weight, powerful enough to silence every anxious thought for a moment. And suddenly they understood the danger they were facing. Fear had been tempting them to interfere with the reconstruction itself. Every desperate attempt to force old doors open again, every emotional reaction driven by panic, every effort to regain artificial control, all of it threatened to delay the transformation heaven was carefully orchestrating. The warning revealed something painful. Not every action that feels urgent is wise. Sometimes fear disguises itself as responsibility. Sometimes impatience pretends to be logic. But the divine architect could not fully rebuild their future while they constantly tried to rescue pieces of the past. And trust becomes most difficult precisely when nothing visible makes sense. From that night forward, they started noticing how often fear tried to pull them backward. Fear wanted immediate answers. Fear wanted reassurance. Fear wanted visible proof before continuing forward. But the reconstruction required faith strong enough to survive uncertainty. So they began practicing stillness instead of reaction. When panic rose, they resisted the urge to destroy their peace by chasing temporary solutions. When loneliness intensified, they stopped running toward unhealthy connections simply to escape discomfort. The warning had awakened discernment inside them. They realized that not every opportunity was aligned. Not every emotional impulse deserved obedience. Some things had to remain broken for the future to be built correctly. This understanding changed the way they viewed suffering itself. Instead of asking, "How do I escape this process?" they slowly began asking, "What is this process trying to teach me?" That shift transformed everything. The reconstruction no longer felt like random punishment. It became sacred preparation, and although the journey remained difficult, the warning protected them from sabotaging their own transformation during moments of fear. The divine architect was still building. Their responsibility was no longer to control the outcome, but to remain still long enough for heaven to finish the work already in progress. The most powerful transformations began happening in complete invisibility. From the outside, their life still looked uncertain, unfinished, and quiet. The major breakthrough had not arrived yet. The external world still showed delays, unanswered questions, and long periods of waiting. But beneath the surface, something extraordinary was taking place inside them. The reconstruction had moved inward, The divine architect was no longer just removing broken foundations from their external life. Now the architect was rebuilding the hidden structure of their soul itself. At first, they did not even recognize the changes, because inner transformation rarely announces itself dramatically. It happens slowly, through repeated nights of surrender, through silent battles nobody else can see, through moments where the spirit learns endurance in places where the old self would have collapsed. They noticed they no longer reacted to fear the same way. Situations that once caused panic now produced stillness instead. The desperate need for constant validation slowly disappeared. The obsession with controlling every outcome weakened day by day. It was as if the collapse had stripped away layers of false identity until only something raw, honest, and spiritually awake remained. And although the process felt lonely at times, there was also a growing sense of clarity emerging within them, a clarity that did not depend on circumstances. The old version of themselves had built confidence on temporary things: success, approval, relationships, routines, predictability. But the divine architect was now building a deeper kind of stability, one rooted beyond external conditions. They were learning how to stand emotionally steady even while life remained uncertain. This frightened them at first, because transformation always requires the death of familiarity. There were moments they barely recognized their own thoughts anymore. Old desires no longer excited them the same way. Conversations that once entertained them suddenly felt shallow and exhausting. Even certain environments carried a strange heaviness, as if their spirit itself was refusing to reconnect with frequencies that belonged to their former life. The inner reconstruction was changing their discernment. They could now sense misalignment faster than before. They began noticing hidden motives behind people's words. They could feel when something looked attractive externally, but carried spiritual emptiness underneath. This new awareness made isolation feel even deeper sometimes, because fewer things resonated with their soul anymore. Yet the loneliness also created space for a new relationship with themselves and with heaven. For the first time in years, they stopped performing spirituality and started experiencing it personally. Prayer became less about asking for immediate rescue and more about learning presence. Silence no longer felt completely empty, because they could sense the architect working within them even when the external world remained unchanged. Slowly, the fear of uncertainty lost its power. They realized that the reconstruction was not merely preparing better circumstances. It was preparing a stronger identity capable of surviving both success and suffering without losing itself. This truth became especially important because the future ahead would demand emotional strength their old self never possessed. The old identity was too fragile, too dependent on comfort, too easily manipulated by fear. That version of them could not carry the weight of the destiny being prepared behind the scenes. So the architect continued rebuilding from within. Some nights the process still hurt deeply, healing exposed wounds they had spent years avoiding. Old memories resurfaced. Buried insecurities demanded confrontation, but now they no longer viewed these moments as setbacks. They understood that healing often becomes painful precisely because hidden damage is finally being revealed. The architect was not trying to shame them through exposure. The architect was trying to free them through truth, and truth always disrupts illusion before creating peace. Over time, they began noticing something remarkable. Despite everything they had lost, they were becoming stronger than they had ever been before. Not louder, not harder, stronger in a quieter, deeper way. A strength built through surrender instead of control. A peace built through endurance instead of comfort. A wisdom built through suffering instead of theory. The inner reconstruction had changed the foundation of who they were becoming. And although the final blueprint still remained mostly hidden, one thing had become undeniable. The person emerging from this process would never again be the same person who entered it. The collapse had destroyed the false self. Now the divine architect was awakening the authentic one. The test arrived quietly, disguised as exhaustion. After months of uncertainty, silence, removals, and inner reconstruction, they reached a point where the soul itself felt tired. Not physically tired alone, but deeply weary from carrying unanswered questions for so long. They had survived the collapse, endured the confusion, and accepted the painful removals, yet the future still remained hidden behind an invisible curtain. And this was the moment the true test finally began. Because surrender sounds beautiful in theory, but real surrender becomes terrifying when heaven asks for trust without timelines, guarantees, or visible proof. The divine architect had brought them to the edge of their own understanding on purpose. Every strategy they once depended on had failed. Every illusion of control had been stripped away. Now there were only two choices left: panic or trust. And the terrifying part was that both choices felt possible every single day. Some mornings they woke up determined to believe the process had meaning. Other mornings, fear returned so strongly that they wanted to abandon everything and run back toward familiarity, even if that familiarity had once destroyed them. The human heart naturally seeks comfort during uncertainty, and the temptation to interrupt the reconstruction became stronger than ever during this season. Old connections suddenly tried reappearing. Temporary opportunities returned wearing attractive disguises. Familiar distractions whispered promises of quick relief from emotional pain. It was as if the universe itself was testing whether they truly wanted transformation or merely temporary escape from discomfort. The test of surrender was not simply about patience. It was about identity. Would they continue becoming the person heaven was rebuilding? Or would they retreat back into the old version of themselves because the unknown felt too heavy? Every day became a spiritual battle between fear and faith. Fear demanded immediate certainty. Fear wanted visible outcomes before continuing forward. Fear kept reminding them of everything they could lose if the process failed. But faith operated differently. Faith whispered that even unfinished reconstruction still carried purpose. Faith reminded them that the collapse had already exposed how unstable the old life truly was. Faith asked them to trust the architect, even while the blueprint remained hidden. Some nights, they almost broke completely. Loneliness intensified. Delays felt unbearable. Watching others move forward, while their own life remained suspended, tested every fragment of emotional endurance they possessed. They questioned whether they were truly being guided or simply wandering through endless uncertainty. Yet every time they reached the edge of giving up, something inside refused to let them fully return to the old life again. The old version of themselves no longer fit. Even if they wanted to rebuild the past, their spirit had already outgrown it. That realization became both painful and liberating. There was no going backward anymore. The reconstruction had progressed too far, and slowly, through repeated moments of surrender, they began understanding something profound. Trust is not a feeling. Trust is a decision made repeatedly in the absence of certainty. The divine architect was teaching them how to continue walking without emotional guarantees. This transformed the way they viewed waiting itself. Waiting was no longer wasted time. Waiting had become training. Every delayed answer strengthened endurance. Every silent night deepened spiritual maturity. Every moment of uncertainty weakened their dependence on external control. The process was creating emotional stability, strong enough to survive future storms without collapsing again. Then, one night, during a moment of complete emotional exhaustion, they finally stopped fighting the process entirely. No more bargaining with heaven. No more demanding explanations. No more chasing artificial certainty. They simply became still. And within that stillness came a peace unlike anything they had experienced before. The circumstances around them had not changed yet, but something inside had shifted permanently. For the first time, surrender no longer felt like loss. It felt like freedom. Freedom from the exhausting burden of trying to control what only the divine architect could fully understand. Freedom from fear-driven decisions. Freedom from the endless pressure to force outcomes before their appointed time. And in that sacred moment, they realized the greatest transformation had already begun long before the visible breakthrough arrived. The real miracle was not merely the future heaven was preparing for them. The real miracle was the person they were becoming while learning how to trust the unseen process completely. The signs did not arrive dramatically at first. There was no sudden lightning from heaven, no instant transformation overnight, no voice echoing through the sky announcing that the suffering was finally over. Instead, the signs appeared quietly, almost carefully, as if the divine architect understood that after everything they had endured, their spirit needed gentle confirmation rather than overwhelming revelation. It began with small moments that felt impossible to dismiss completely. Strange coincidences started happening with unusual timing. Certain answers appeared exactly when fear became strongest. Conversations with strangers carried words that felt directly connected to prayers nobody else knew they had spoken. Doors that had remained closed for months suddenly opened without struggle. And perhaps most surprising of all, they began feeling moments of peace in situations that once would have destroyed them emotionally. At first, they questioned whether they were simply imagining meaning because they desperately wanted reassurance. But the signs continued appearing too consistently to ignore. The same messages repeated through different people, unexpected opportunities aligned with the exact inner transformation they had been experiencing. Even their intuition became sharper, guiding them away from environments and decisions that no longer matched the future being prepared for them. It felt as though invisible threads were finally moving into alignment after a long season of disorder. Slowly, the realization began settling into their spirit. The reconstruction was working. The unseen process that once felt painfully silent was now revealing evidence of its existence in the physical world. The divine architect had never stopped building. The work had simply been happening beyond human visibility. And now, piece by piece, fragments of the hidden blueprint were beginning to surface. This changed the way they viewed their past suffering completely. The collapse no longer looked meaningless. Every removal suddenly connected to future protection. Every delay revealed itself as preparation rather than rejection. Certain relationships had ended because they would have distracted them from their true path. Certain opportunities had failed because they were too small for the destiny ahead. Even the loneliness now made sense because isolation had developed the emotional endurance necessary for what was coming next. The signs did not erase the pain they had experienced, but they transformed its meaning. Suffering without purpose destroys people. Suffering connected to purpose transforms them. And now they could finally sense the purpose unfolding beneath every difficult season they survived. Yet the signs were not only external. The deepest confirmations were happening internally. Fear no longer controlled them the same way. Situations that once triggered panic now produced discernment instead. They noticed how emotionally different they had become compared to the person who first entered the collapse. Their reactions had changed. Their priorities had shifted. Their dependence on external validation had weakened dramatically. The reconstruction was visible not only in circumstances, but in identity itself. They had become stronger without becoming harder, wiser without becoming colder, more peaceful without needing constant certainty. This inner transformation became the clearest sign of all that the divine architect had truly been working the entire time. Then came the moments that felt almost supernatural in their precision. Prayers they had forgotten suddenly received answers months later in unexpected forms. Connections appeared with people who carried exactly the wisdom or opportunities needed for the next stage of their journey. Timing itself began feeling orchestrated rather than random. The more they surrendered control, the more life seemed to move with invisible intelligence guiding events into place. It was not perfection yet. Challenges still existed. The final future had not fully manifested. But hope had returned now, not as shallow optimism, but as deep spiritual certainty, born through survival. They no longer needed constant proof because the signs had already confirmed enough. The architect's fingerprints were everywhere now. Looking backward, they could finally trace the hidden path through every painful season they once misunderstood. The collapse had created space. The silence had developed trust. The removals had protected destiny. The confusion had broken dependence on control. The surrender had transformed identity, and now the signs were revealing what heaven had been preparing all along. For the first time in a very long time, they no longer feared the future. They sensed that something greater was approaching, something carefully designed, through every unseen moment of reconstruction. And although they still could not see the entire blueprint clearly, they finally understood one undeniable truth. The divine architect had never abandoned them for a single moment. Every stage of the process had been leading here toward the beginning of a future far more meaningful than the life they once begged to preserve. The revelation did not arrive in a single explosive moment. It unfolded slowly, almost tenderly, like sunrise after the longest night imaginable. One day, they simply realized they were no longer the same person who had first entered the collapse. The fear that once controlled every decision no longer ruled their spirit. The desperation that once drove them toward unhealthy attachments had disappeared. Even the uncertainty that once felt unbearable had somehow become the very thing that taught them strength. And as this realization settled into their heart, they finally began understanding what the divine architect had been building all along. The old life had not been destroyed to punish them. It had been dismantled to release them. Everything they once mourned losing now looked different through awakened eyes. The relationships that ended were no longer viewed as tragedies, but as divine separations necessary for growth. The closed doors that once caused tears were now revealed as protection from futures too small for their true calling. The silence that once felt like abandonment had actually been sacred preparation. Every painful stage of the process suddenly connected together with breathtaking clarity. Nothing had been random. Nothing had been wasted. Even their suffering had carried hidden purpose beyond human understanding. Looking back, they could now see how carefully the divine architect had guided every detail, even during moments when heaven seemed absent. The blueprint had always existed. They simply could not see it while standing inside the middle of reconstruction. But now the foundation was complete enough for the future to finally emerge. Opportunities appeared that aligned perfectly with the person they had become during the process. New connections entered their life, carrying peace instead of confusion. Doors opened naturally, without the exhausting force they once used trying to control outcomes. There was flow where struggle once dominated, clarity where confusion once lived. And perhaps the most shocking transformation of all was this: they no longer needed external success to feel whole. The reconstruction had created something far deeper than temporary achievement. It had rebuilt their identity from the inside out. For the first time in their life, they understood that true peace is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the presence of trust, even while uncertainty still exists. This new future was not perfect in the human sense. Challenges still existed. Difficult days still came. But now they faced life differently, because their foundation had changed completely. The old self would have collapsed under pressure, desperately trying to regain control through fear. But the new self understood something the old self never could. The divine architect remains present even during seasons that make no sense. That truth changed the way they walked through every future storm. They no longer panicked when temporary things shifted, because they had already survived the great collapse and discovered that endings can become sacred beginnings. They no longer feared removals because they understood that heaven sometimes subtracts in order to multiply later. They no longer demanded immediate answers because silence itself had taught them endurance, wisdom, and spiritual depth. The reconstruction had permanently transformed the way they viewed both pain and purpose. And then came the final realization: the truth, powerful enough to redefine their entire story forever. The future they once begged heaven for would have destroyed the person they used to be. The blessings ahead required a stronger spirit, a healed identity, and a deeper foundation than they originally possessed. That is why the collapse had been necessary. That is why the waiting had lasted so long. The divine architect was never delaying their future out of cruelty. The architect was preparing them to carry it without breaking. Suddenly, every painful night gained meaning. Every tear carried purpose. Every unanswered prayer became part of a much larger design. And standing there, transformed by everything they survived, they finally understood the sentence heaven had been writing across their entire journey from the very beginning. What looked like destruction was actually reconstruction. Their old life had to fall apart because their true future could never fit inside the person they used to be. The collapse was not the end of their story. It was the moment the real story finally began.